The sky over Millhaven cracked open like glass, and I was already running before the sound reached me. A streak of white fire tore across the clouds and slammed into the far end of our wheat field. The ground shook under my boots. Heat rolled across the night air in a wave that smelled like burning metal. I did not stop to think. I did not call for help. I just ran toward the smoke, because that is what you do when something falls out of the sky less than half a mile from your house. By the time I reached the wreck, the flames were already climbing the broken hull. It was not a plane. It was not anything I had ever seen. The metal was curved in ways that made no sense, dark gray with strange markings glowing faint blue along the seams. Smoke poured from a crack in the side, and through that crack I saw movement. Someone was alive in there. I grabbed a length of pipe from the fence line and jammed it into the crack, pulling with everything I had until the metal gave way. The heat scorched my hands, but I kept pulling. When the gap was wide enough, I looked inside and saw her. She was pinned under a piece of the ship, one arm free, reaching for a blade near her hip, as if she still had the strength to fight whatever had found her. Her skin was a shade of violet I had never seen on anything living, and even trapped and bleeding. Her eyes locked onto mine with a kind of fury that made my chest go tight. I did not have time to be afraid. The fire was close now, and the whole wreck groaned like it wanted to collapse. I reached in and pulled. She was heavier than she looked, dense muscle under strange armor, and she fought me at first, snarling something in a language I did not understand. But when the ship shifted and sparks rained down around us, she stopped fighting and let me drag her clear. We collapsed in the wheat, just as the wreck folded in on itself behind us, the flames finally swallowing whatever secrets it still held. She lay there breathing hard, staring at the night sky like she expected it to answer for what had happened to her. Then she turned her head and looked at me, and in a voice rough with pain, she said the first words I ever heard her speak in a language I understood. "You should not have done that." I remember laughing, even though nothing about that night was funny. I told her she was welcome. She did not seem to know what to do with that. I did not know her name yet. I did not know what she was, or where she had come from, or that pulling her out of that fire would change the rest of my life. All I knew was that I could not leave a person to burn, even if that person had skin the color of a bruised plum, and eyes that looked like they had seen more war than I would ever understand. I got her into the old barn before the searchlights arrived. I do not know how I explained the smoke to my father the next morning, or how I convinced myself that hiding an injured stranger from the government was a reasonable thing to do. Looking back, I think some part of me already knew she was not going to be an ordinary stranger. Her name was Varesh. She told me on the third night, when the fever from her wounds finally broke, and she stopped trying to convince me she did not need my help. Varesh Dun Kai, she said, like the name itself was a warning. Warrior of the Caliph line. I told her my name was Ethan. She repeated it once, testing the shape of it in her mouth, and never mispronounced it again. The weeks that followed were strange in a way I still find hard to explain. I brought her food and clean water and old blankets from the house. She healed faster than any person I had ever known, faster than seemed possible, and within days she was already moving with the kind of controlled strength that made the barn feel smaller whenever she stood up straight. She did not thank me. Not at first. She told me, more than once, that humans were a soft and short-lived species, barely worth the notice of her people. She said our wars were small, our lives were short, and our comforts made us weak. I told her that if we were so weak, she might want to explain why a soft and short-lived human was the one who pulled her out of a burning wreck, while her own warrior strength had done nothing but keep her pinned under a piece of broken metal. She did not have an answer for that. It became a kind of game between us after that first argument. She would insult something about human life, and I would find the flaw in her logic, and she would scowl at me like I had personally offended her ancestors. It should have been unbearable. Instead, it became the best part of my day. I learned pieces of her world in those weeks. She spoke of her people as if they were carved from something harder than stone, a species that measured strength in centuries rather than years. that saw softness as a kind of failure. She had been on a scouting mission when something struck her ship, though she never told me exactly what, only that it had something to do with trouble among her own people rather than an accident. She asked me questions too, though she pretended not to care about the answers. She asked why I stayed on a farm instead of leaving for a bigger life. She asked why humans kept animals as companions instead of tools. She asked, one night when she thought I was already asleep, what it felt like to know your life would end so soon. I did not have a good answer for that one either. I told her it made the good days matter more. She was quiet for a long time after that. By the end of the third week, she could stand without pain and walk without favoring her side. She started helping around the barn without being asked, lifting things that should have needed two people, fixing a section of fence with her bare hands faster than I could have managed with tools. My father noticed the extra work getting done and never asked who was doing it. I think, in his own way, he understood there were some questions better left alone. It was on the last night that the sky answered. A pulse of light rose from somewhere deep inside the wreckage, a signal she said would only activate once her people had a fixed location. She stood very still when she saw it, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked almost sad. "They are coming for me," she said. I asked if that was good or bad. She said it depended on which faction had heard the signal first. I did not fully understand what she meant, not then, but the way she said it made my stomach turn cold. We stood in the field that night waiting for whatever would come. She turned to me before the light in the sky grew bright enough to blind us both. "Human," she said, and there was none of the mockery left in her voice. "You saved something that owed you nothing. My people do not forget debts like that." I told her she did not owe me anything. She said that was exactly the kind of thing a soft-hearted human would say, and for the first time, there was no insult in the word soft. A ship descended through the clouds, sleek and silent, nothing like the wreck that had first brought her to me. She looked at it, then back at me, and something in her expression cracked just slightly, enough that I saw it before she hid it away again. "I will remember you," she said, "longer than your kind measures time." I wanted to ask her to stay. I wanted to ask 100 things. But the ship's ramp lowered, and figures in armor like hers stepped out to meet her, and I understood that whatever this had been, it was ending the same way it began, sudden and without warning. She walked toward the ship, then stopped, and looked back one last time. "Do not let the fire take everything you love, Ethan," she said. "Some things are worth pulling from the flames twice." Then she was gone, swallowed by light and engine sound, and the field went dark and quiet, the way it had been before she ever fell into it. I stood there long after the ship disappeared, staring at a sky that no longer held any trace of her, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But the scorched circle of earth behind me was real. The bent section of fence she had fixed with her bare hands was real. And the ache in my chest, the one that stayed long after that night, was more real than anything else in my life had ever been. I told myself she would come back. I did not know it would take years to find out if that was true. The years came quietly at first, then all at once, the way most years do. My father passed 2 winters after that night in the field, and I buried him beside my mother on the low hill where our family had always laid its dead. I kept the farm running because it was the only thing that still felt like home, even after home had grown emptier than I liked to admit. I told myself the ache I carried was grief for him. I did not let myself examine how much of it belonged to someone else. The world had changed too, in ways that made the quiet ache of one farmer feel small by comparison. What had once been a secret buried in government files became public within a year of that night, when a Caliph cruiser was spotted breaking atmosphere over a coastal city in broad daylight. There was no hiding it after that. News channels argued for months about what it meant. Governments scrambled to form councils and treaties with beings none of them fully understood. Ordinary people argued in diners and grocery stores about whether the aliens were here to help us or study us, or simply wait until we were useful enough to take. I never told anyone about the woman I pulled from a burning wreck, years before the world knew her kind existed. It felt like something too strange and too personal to hand over to strangers who would only turn it into another headline. Earth's place among the wider galaxy settled into something uneasy. We were, by every account I heard, the youngest and smallest voice at any table we were invited to sit at. Older species spoke about humanity the way you might speak about a clever animal, impressive for its size, but not yet proven. I heard the word primitive more than once in broadcasts meant to reassure the public. It never reassured me. I built a life around the ache instead of letting it stop me. I took a job managing supply routes for a regional freight company, work that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied enough to not wander toward a field and a fire I still dreamed about some nights. I made friends. I let Nathan Brooks, a man I had known since school, talk me into weekend fishing trips that mostly ended with neither of us catching anything and both of us laughing about it anyway. I even let myself fall into something that looked like love, or close enough to it that I stopped questioning the difference. Her name was Claire Whitfield, a schoolteacher with a sharp sense of humor and very little patience for my quiet moods. She never asked why I sometimes stared too long at the night sky. I think she assumed it was grief for my father, and I let her believe that, because the truth felt too large to hand to someone still learning the shape of me. 10 years is nothing to a species like the one I once hid in my barn. 10 years to me was a mortgage, a dead father, a career I had settled into rather than chosen, and a promise I had quietly stopped believing would ever be kept. I told myself she was gone. Not dead, I hoped, but gone the way a season goes, something that passes and does not return. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things during those years that were not entirely true. The trouble started the way most trouble does, quietly, and then all at once. It began with static. Every radio and screen in Millhaven flickered at the same moment, a single burst of interference that lasted only a few seconds but left half the town standing in their kitchens and driveways, staring up at a clear evening sky. Nathan called me before I had even set down my coffee, asking if I had seen the news yet. I told him I had not. He told me to turn it on. The broadcast showed grainy footage of 3 unidentified vessels breaking through the upper atmosphere over the northern coast, moving in a formation that every analyst on screen agreed did not match any registered Calith patrol or any of the dozen or so allied species Earth had cautiously exchanged treaties with over the past decade. Officials urged calm. Nobody sounded calm. Claire came over that night, worried in the quiet way she got when she did not want to admit she was worried. We sat on the porch and watched the horizon like the rest of the country was probably doing, half expecting the sky to answer with something worse than static. It did not happen that night. It happened 3 nights later, and it happened close enough to see with my own eyes. I was driving back from a supply run when the road ahead of me lit up with a burst of orange light, followed by a low shudder that rattled the truck's windows. I pulled over along with half a dozen other drivers, and we all watched as something fast and low crossed the tree line half a mile off, chased by streaks of return fire I recognized instantly, even after 10 years, as Calith weapon signatures. Something was fighting in our skies. Something Earth had no part in, except as the ground it was happening over. The town spent the next 2 days in a state of nervous quiet. Military vehicles rolled through on the main road, heading toward the coast, and nobody in Millhaven pretended not to notice. Claire asked me, more than once, if I thought we were in danger. I did not have a good answer, because for the first time since that night in the wheat field, I felt the old fear return, sharp and specific, the kind of fear that comes from recognizing something rather than fearing the unknown. On the 3rd night, the sky over my farm lit up the exact same way it had 10 years before. I was standing in the yard before I even realized I had moved, watching a single ship break through the clouds, trailing fire and smoke the way its ancestor once had, except this one did not crash. It slowed and turned and came down in the very same field where I had once pulled a stranger from the wreckage of her own arrival. I recognized the shape of it before the engines had even gone quiet. Something in my chest recognized it before my mind caught up. The hatch opened with a hiss of released pressure, and light spilled out across the wheat, and I stood there with my heart hammering, unable to move, unable to look away, waiting to see if the years had made a liar out of a promise made a decade ago, under a very different sky. She stepped down the ramp with the same controlled strength I remembered, though everything else about her had changed. Her armor was heavier now, marked with symbols I did not recognize, the kind that spoke of rank rather than simple service. There were new lines at the corners of her eyes, not many, but enough to tell me that wherever she had spent those 10 years, it had not been an easy decade for someone from a species that aged slower than mine. She stopped a few paces from me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. Then she spoke, and her voice cracked in a way I had never heard from her before, not even when she was bleeding out in the wreckage of her own ship. "Human," she said, "I never forgot you." I wanted to be angry. Some part of me had spent 10 years building a wall meant to catch exactly this moment, meant to protect whatever was left of me from a woman who could disappear into the stars again as easily as she had the first time. But standing there in the same field where it all began, the wall did not hold the way I expected it to. "You could have sent a signal," I said, because it was easier to say than everything else crowding my throat. Anything. A single message in 10 years. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw something close to shame cross her face, an expression that looked strange on someone built like a living weapon. "I could not," she said, "not without putting you in danger from people who would have used you against me." I asked her what that meant. She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked past me, toward the house, toward the life she must have known I had built in her absence, and something in her posture shifted, as if she was bracing herself for a wound she expected to receive. "You have someone," she said. It was not a question. I told her the truth, because there was no version of this moment where lying would have helped either of us. I told her about Claire, about the quiet life I had built, trying not to wait for something that felt impossible. Faresh nodded slowly, and to her credit, she did not argue or demand or claim any right to the years she had missed. "I did not come back to take anything from you," she said. "I came back because I owe you a truth, and because Earth is in more danger tonight than it has ever been." That got my full attention. She told me, piece by piece, the way soldiers tell hard truths, about a war that had consumed her homeworld not long after she left my barn that first time, a faction within her own people, one that saw any alliance with younger species as a weakness that would drag the Caliph Empire down to our level, had risen against the treaty makers who believed otherwise. She had spent the past decade fighting that war, not for glory, but to protect a fragile agreement that kept species like mine from being treated as resources rather than neighbors. She had won that war, mostly. But wars like that do not end cleanly, and the faction she had spent 10 years fighting had scattered rather than surrendered. And tonight the ships that had lit up Millhaven's sky belonged to what remained of them, here on Earth for reasons that had nothing to do with diplomacy. "They believe destroying the first treaty world will break what remains of the alliance," she said. "And Ethan, they know exactly where to start." Behind her, the sky lit up again, brighter this time, closer, and somewhere in the distance an alarm began to wail across the valley, the same alarm Millhaven had only ever tested and never actually needed. Varesh turned toward the sound, her whole body shifting into the readiness of someone who had spent a decade learning exactly what that alarm meant. "They are already here," she said, "and we do not have much time left to decide what we are going to do about it." The alarm did not stop, and neither did we. Varesh moved toward her ship without waiting for me to answer, already calling instructions into a small device strapped to her wrist, her voice sharp and fast in a language I did not understand but recognized the shape of someone giving orders in the middle of a fight already underway. I followed her because standing still had never once solved anything in my life, and because the field behind my house was about to become a battlefield whether I chose to stand in it or not. The first strike hit the edge of town before we even reached her ship. I felt it before I heard it, a pressure wave that rattled through the ground and up through my boots, followed by a boom that rolled across the valley and left my ears ringing. A column of smoke rose from the direction of Millhaven's grain silos, the tallest structures for miles, and I understood with a cold clarity that whoever was attacking us had chosen a target meant to be seen from every farmhouse in the county. Varesh's jaw tightened at the sight of it. "They want fear more than damage," she said. "Fear spreads faster than fire." I asked her what we were supposed to do against ships that could level a grain silo from orbit. She looked at me, and for the first time since she stepped off that ramp, something like her old mocking humor returned to her eyes, though there was no mockery in her voice. "We are not fighting their ships," she said. "We are fighting the ones they send down to finish the job. And that, human, is a fight your people are better suited for than mine." She was right, though it took the rest of that night to prove it. Word spread through Millhaven fast, the way word always does in small towns, except this time it was Nathan pounding on my door with a rifle slung over his shoulder and 3 of our neighbors behind him, all of them looking at Varesh like she might be the reason the sky had opened up over us, and all of them looking at me like I owed them an explanation I did not have time to give. I gave them the short version. A war among the stars had followed her home, and whatever remained of an enemy faction intended to make an example of the first world that dared to treat her people as equals. Nathan did not ask a single follow-up question. He just nodded, checked his rifle, and asked what the plan was. Varesh's ship carried scanning equipment far beyond anything Earth possessed, and within an hour she had mapped 3 drop points where smaller Kalith vessels, the kind meant to carry ground troops rather than orbital weapons, intended to land across the county. She explained, in the clipped tone of someone used to briefing soldiers, that the orbital ships would not risk firing again so close to their own people once boots were on the ground, which meant the real fight would happen where humans had always fought best, in the dirt, at close range, with whatever tools were on hand. "We are not equipped for this," I told her, watching Nathan and our neighbors gather what weapons a farming community actually owned, mostly hunting rifles and a few pieces of old farm equipment nobody had touched since harvest. She looked at the gathering crowd, at the mismatched weapons and the mismatched courage standing behind them, and something in her expression shifted into an assessment I did not expect. "Your species survived without our technology for its entire history," she said. "You do not need to match their strength. You only need to be harder to kill than they expect." It turned out to be exactly the right kind of plan for exactly the wrong-looking army. The first Kalith dropship came down in the old quarry, 2 miles east of town, chosen, Varesh guessed, because its open ground looked like easy territory for a landing party expecting no resistance. What they found instead was a quarry, rigged with every trick a lifetime of farming had taught men like Nathan, tripwires connected to old propane tanks, pits covered with brush, and a dozen armed neighbors who knew every inch of that quarry better than any invader ever could. I was not there for that fight. Varesh kept me with her at the second drop point, a decision I argued against and lost, because she said, flatly, that she had already lost me to fire once and did not intend to test her luck twice in one lifetime. The second drop point was the field behind my own farm, the same field where all of this had started 10 years before. It felt, standing there in the dark with Varesh at my side and a handful of neighbors spread out along the fence line, like the whole shape of my life had folded back on itself, bringing me exactly to the place I needed to be. The enemy ship descended just past midnight, sleek and dark, nothing like the wreck that had first brought Varesh crashing into my world. Its ramp lowered, and armored figures marched out in tight formation, weapons raised, moving with the confidence of soldiers who expected nothing but frightened farmers waiting to be swept aside. They got neither fear nor an easy fight. Varesh moved first, faster than I had ever seen her move even during her recovery all those years ago, closing the distance before the lead soldier had fully cleared the ramp. What followed was not a battle I can describe with any real detail, because it happened too fast for my eyes to properly track, only flashes of motion and the sound of metal striking metal and the occasional flare of energy weapons lighting up the dark. My part in it was smaller and stranger, and in its own way just as important. While Varesh held the center of their formation, Nathan and I worked the edges, using tools we knew better than any soldier could, an old grain auger rigged to disable one of their vehicles, a length of chain strung across the field low enough to catch a running soldier off guard. Small advantages stacked one on top of another until the fight tilted, slowly and then all at once, in our favor. It was not clean. It was not easy. There were moments that night I do not like to remember clearly, moments where the line between defending my home and simply surviving blurred into something I still think about more than I would like to admit. But when the last of their formation fell back toward their ship, wounded and disorganized, Varesh standing in the middle of the field, breathing hard but very much alive, I understood something I had never fully understood before. We were not the soft, short-lived species her people had once dismissed. We were something else entirely, something that did not know how to stop fighting once it decided a thing was worth protecting. The remaining Kalith ship lifted off before dawn, retreating rather than risking another landing, and word came in over Varesh's wrist device that the quarry fight had ended much the same way, with an enemy force that expected an easy massacre finding instead a town that refused to break. Varesh found me sitting on the same fence I had once repaired with her help, watching the sun rise over a field that had seen more history in one night than most places see in a lifetime. She sat beside me without a word, and for a long moment we just watched the light come up together. "They will not stop with one failed attempt," she said eventually. "Their fleet in orbit still has enough strength to try again, and next time they will not send troops. They will send fire." I asked her what that meant for us. She looked at me, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there the night before, something that looked almost like hope surviving in a place it had no right to. "It means," she said, "that this fight is not over, but for the first time in 10 years, I do not think we are going to lose it." The final battle did not begin with an alarm. It began with silence, the kind that settles over a town right before something enormous happens, the kind every person in Millhaven seemed to feel at the exact same moment, because by mid-morning the streets had emptied and every eye in the county was turned toward the sky. Varesh's scanners picked up the change first. The remaining Kalith fleet, 3 cruisers that had circled quietly since the failed ground assault, began moving into a tighter formation above the coast. The kind of positioning, she said, only meant one thing: a coordinated strike meant to end the resistance from orbit rather than risk more soldiers on the ground. "We have perhaps 2 hours," she told the gathered crowd outside my barn, a crowd that had grown overnight from a handful of neighbors to nearly half the town, all of them drawn by rumor and fear and the strange, stubborn hope that maybe, somehow, this was a fight that could still be won. I asked her if there was anything her single ship could do against 3 cruisers. She admitted, honestly, that there was not alone, but she had already been on her wrist device most of the night, and what she told us next changed the shape of everything that followed. Word of the attack had reached beyond Millhaven, beyond the county, beyond the country even, carried by the same broadcast networks that had once turned the mere existence of aliens into public panic. Now those same networks were carrying footage of farmers standing against an invading force with nothing but hunting rifles and stubborn courage, and the response had been immediate and enormous. Military transports had been moving toward us since the previous night, coordinated for the first time not just by our own government, but by the shaky alliance Earth had built over the past decade with the very treaty makers Varesh had spent 10 years protecting. It turned out that a fragile alliance, tested by exactly this kind of crisis, was worth more than anyone had given it credit for. By the time the first cruiser broke formation to begin its descent, the sky above Millhaven was no longer empty. Earth fighters, faster and more maneuverable than anything the aging cruisers expected to face from a species they still quietly called primitive, rose to meet them, joined by 2 allied Kalith vessels loyal to the treaty that Varesh had bled for across an entire decade. I watched that battle from the ground with the rest of the town, necks craned upward, hearts in our throats, watching streaks of light trace impossible patterns across the morning sky. It was nothing like the ground fight from the night before. It was faster, louder, and far beyond anything human hands could directly influence. Except it was not entirely beyond us. Varesh had one more piece of the plan, one she had kept quiet until the moment it mattered, because she said some things needed to be seen before they could be believed. The lead cruiser, the one carrying the enemy commander responsible for the entire assault, had been damaged during the ground battle the night before, its shields weakened just enough by systems Varesh and I had sabotaged together in that field behind my farm. It was vulnerable in a way its commander did not yet know. Varesh's ship, small and fast where the cruisers were large and slow, cut through the chaos of the larger battle and drove straight for that weakened cruiser, weaving between larger vessels with a precision that made my chest ache with something between fear and pride. I was in the seat beside her, because when she asked if I trusted her enough to fly into the middle of that fight, I discovered I did, completely, without hesitation, the same way I had trusted her enough to pull her from a burning wreck 10 years before. The final approach felt like it lasted both a single heartbeat and an entire lifetime. Varesh guided her small ship through a gap in the larger cruiser's defenses, one she had studied from the moment she first noticed the damage, and delivered a strike aimed not at destroying the massive vessel, but at disabling its command systems entirely. The cruiser went dark mid-flight, drifting without power, its weapons falling silent, its threat neutralized without a single life lost in the process. A choice Varesh made deliberately, because she told me afterward that a war ended with mercy left more room for peace than one ended with total destruction. The remaining two cruisers, seeing their commander's ship disabled and their ground forces already defeated the night before, broke formation and retreated, chased briefly by Allied fighters before being allowed to withdraw entirely, a decision made not out of weakness, but because Varesh insisted that a defeated enemy allowed to leave carried a different kind of message than one destroyed out of anger. "Let them go home and tell their people what happened here," she said, watching the last cruiser vanish beyond the clouds. "Let them tell their people that Earth was not the easy target they believed it to be." The town gathered in the field behind my farm that evening, the same field that had seen a crash, a friendship, a decade of silence, a battle, and now, finally, something that felt very much like victory. Nathan found me near the fence, exhausted in the particular way that comes after a day spent believing you might not survive it, and clapped a hand on my shoulder without saying much of anything at all, because sometimes there is nothing that needs to be said. Varesh found me there too, once the last of the ships had gone quiet, and the sky had settled back into something resembling peace. She looked tired in a way I had never seen from her, not during her recovery all those years ago, not even during the worst of the fighting the night before. It was the tired of someone who had been carrying a war for 10 years and had finally, for the first time, set part of that weight down. "We did not lose," she said quietly, staring up at a sky finally free of enemy ships. I told her we had not lost anything that mattered, and that felt like the truest thing I had said all day. The days that followed the battle passed slower than the fighting itself, the way aftermath always does, filled with the quiet work of cleaning up, rebuilding what had been damaged, and adjusting to a world that had shifted overnight, in ways nobody in Millhaven had asked for, but everyone now had to live with. Earth's place among the stars changed almost immediately. Footage of farmers standing against an invading force, followed by the arrival of an allied fleet that treated Earth as a partner worth defending rather than a resource worth managing, spread across every network on the planet and beyond it. The word primitive, so common in broadcasts before that day, grew quieter, replaced slowly by a grudging kind of respect that Varesh told me was rare among older species, and rarer still to earn this quickly. I ended things with Claire not long after, gently, honestly, in a conversation that hurt in the way honest conversations sometimes do, but felt necessary in a way I could not have explained to her, even if I had tried. She told me she had always known there was something I was not saying, some ache she could never quite reach the bottom of, and she was not entirely surprised when the truth finally came out. She wished me well, and I believed she meant it, and we parted as something closer to friends than either of us expected. Varesh stayed in Millhaven longer than her duties technically required, officially to oversee the transition of the treaty into something stronger. Unofficially, She admitted one evening on that same fence where so much of our story had already happened, because she was not ready to leave again so soon after finally coming back. We sat there most evenings after that, watching the sun go down over a field that held more history for the two of us than any other place in the galaxy, and slowly, carefully, we talked about the parts of the last 10 years we had not yet told each other. She told me about battles she had fought, and friends she had lost. I told her about my father, about the quiet years, about the ache I had never fully let go of, even when I convinced myself I had. One evening, weeks after the fighting had ended, she asked me a question she had never asked before, not even in the early days, when curiosity about human life seemed to interest her despite herself. "If I stayed," she said, carefully, as if testing the shape of the words before committing to them, "what would that mean for a life as short as yours, spent beside one as long as mine?" I told her the truth, because it was the only answer that felt fair to either of us. I told her it would mean loving someone for however many years I had, instead of loving no one at all for a lifetime spent waiting for a promise I was not sure would ever be kept. I told her that a short, full life sounded better to me than a long, careful one spent avoiding exactly this kind of risk. She was quiet for a long time after that, staring out at the same field where she had once told me humans measured nothing the way her people did, where she had once said, "Our short lives made our comforts feel like weakness." When she finally spoke again, her voice held none of that old certainty. "Then I would like to stay," she said, "not out of duty, not because your people need protecting, but because I have spent 10 years fighting to get back to a promise I made in this exact field, and I do not intend to spend whatever years remain to either of us anywhere else." I told her that sounded like the best decision either of us had made in a decade, and she laughed, really laughed, in a way I had never heard from her before, warm and unguarded, and entirely unlike the warrior who once mocked human softness as a flaw rather than a strength. Millhaven rebuilt slowly, the way towns do, and the fence around that field got repaired one more time, this time by both of us together rather than her alone while I slept. Earth's place among the stars kept shifting too, cautious but real, a small and stubborn species finally being seen by its neighbors as something worth respecting rather than simply tolerating. Varesh never fully explained why her people had chosen to see us differently after that day, though I suspect it had less to do with the battle itself and more to do with what came after it, a species that had every reason to celebrate victory with anger, instead choosing mercy for a defeated enemy, choosing to let them go home and tell their own people the truth instead of erasing them entirely. It was, she told me once, exactly the kind of thing her people had never expected from a species they once called primitive. I still think about that first night sometimes, the crash, the fire, the stranger I pulled from wreckage without knowing what it would cost or give me in return. I think about the years of silence, the ache I built a life around without ever fully understanding it, the promise I stopped believing would ever be kept. But mostly, now, I think about the evenings on that fence, the sun going down over a field that has seen more of my life than any other place on Earth, and a woman beside me who once told me she would remember me longer than my kind measures time, and who came back, across a decade and a war and every reason to stay away, simply because a promise made in a burning field meant more to her than any distance or danger ever could. "Human," she told me again, not long ago, on a quiet evening much like all the others we have shared since that day. "I never forgot you." I told her I never stopped hoping she would not, and for the first time in 10 long years, that hope finally felt like something solid enough to build the rest of a life around.